No, he's like a pussy. Yeah. I don't know. All right. Hello. Good evening. If I could welcome you to the Foreign Correspondents Club of Thailand. For people who are looking for seats, we've got a lot available down here. If you'd like to come in closer and fill the space. Still got a few people coming through the doors. Anyway, if I could ask for your silence now, please. On Friday night, if you have nothing better to do, we're holding a trivia night. So there's competitions for teams of 6, pub style, part of the new activities at the club. On the 30th, we will be holding our program on the Philippine elections, which will include Jonathan Head and other people who reported on it. This program was delayed by the fact that the club got flooded last week and we lost all our power. On the 2nd of June, we have Thailand's Me Too moment, the politics of sexual assault, and that's a panel discussion in relation to recent developments here. This is probably the first program that we've been able to run at this level in about 2 years. And as you may have noticed, we've taken off the live streaming. The live streaming has kept the profile of the club up, and we've done it as a public service. Essentially, a lot of work went into it, but it yielded literally zero in terms of income. And the club has really been severely damaged. We've lost millions of baht. We've managed to maintain our membership. We're back up to about 700. We had the best collections on membership in 8 years, and we're very grateful to people for supporting the club, even when it wasn't as available to them as normal. Hopefully we're emerging from that, and we can get back to regular events such as Wednesday night programs and other things that are being planned. Anyway, your support is greatly valued. Right. Good, sorry, I haven't done this for a while. So tonight we are revisiting Benjamin Zawaki's 2017 book, The Shifting Ground Between the US and a Rising China. He brought that book out. As with all books, things change and move forward, so he's produced a second edition which places it in a new context. And copies of that book are available at the front of the clubhouse if you wish to have one. We have an exceptionally distinguished panel tonight, including Ralph Skip Boyce, who is the embodiment of Thai-US relations, I would say, from 1988 to 2007, when he was the ambassador. He's also been an ambassador in Indonesia and chargé d'affaires in Singapore, and he now lives in Thailand. He closed his career in the business sector with Boeing in Singapore, and he was the president for Southeast Asia. We have sitting on my right Joe Horn Patanotai. I'm going to make a mess. Patanotai.
Ignore all the H's. Take out all the H's.
Sorry. His Chinese name Chang Yang Zhu, terribly pronounced, but a lot easier. He founded Strategy 613 in 2000 to provide blue chip companies with investment advice, principally for Thailand and China, and most recently in the context of China's Belt and Road Initiative. Joe is British Thai and a Cambridge graduate, and he was very interestingly partly educated in Beijing. His family is Sino-Thai royalty in a way. I mean, the connection is extraordinary because his mother, Sarin, and her brother, Wonwai, were sent to China following the Bandung Conference in 1956 by their father, Sang, who was the chief advisor to the Thai Prime Minister at that time, Field Marshal Pibun Songkran. And the two of them witnessed the Cultural Revolution as the wards of Premier Zhou Enlai. And finally, we have Benjamin, who today is a senior specialist with the Asia Foundation. He was a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations until 2006 and a visiting fellow at Harvard Law School in 2014 and 15. He served as a policy advisor to President Jimmy Carter and to two other elders in Myanmar in 2013, and was Amnesty International Southeast Asia researcher for 5 years until 2012. He's also worked for several UN agencies. With that, what we're going to do is go to Skip, who is going to give us an overview of the shifting relationship between Thailand and the US during his period from 1988 onwards. Skip, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks. And can you hear me okay?
Yes, absolutely fine.
Okay, well, hello to you, Dominic. Hello to Joe, Benjamin, and I'm sure many old friends in the audience. Congratulations to Benjamin on the second edition. I'm not sure, frankly, how much bandwidth the US-Thai relationship has right now, given the focus on Ukraine and everything else. But I think that we're here tonight to talk about what Benjamin's second edition and even the first edition warned about, which is about a relationship which is on the decline. So what I want to do in my segment here is review not the relationship since the US and Thailand had their first diplomatic relationship in Asia. No, not the Treaty of Amity. No, the post-World War II period is what I want to talk about. And I want to talk about, unfortunately, the rise and fall of a special relationship. And I think that the rise and fall of this special relationship comes in 4 acts. Okay, so the first act is the immediate post-Second World War period, which was a very unnatural period where the US was the sole superpower, not just in this region, but everywhere. The UK, USSR, fellow winners, both recovering from terrible, terrible wartime period. China, internally preoccupied. Japan, defeated, occupied. Europe, decolonizing amidst the devastation of the Second World War. India, seeking independence. And the Cold War looming. And in this theater, the US and Thailand came into the special relationship at the very, very beginning, based on really not too much other than the support for the Sari Thai, Free Thai movement during the Second World War, which the US did in its version of the Thai students who were studying in the US, and the British did in their version of the Thai students studying in the UK. And what happened in the immediate post-war period was the UK wanted reparations from Thailand because Thailand had been an ally of Japan in the Second World War. Technically true, but the US said no, that's not appropriate, which partially reflected the fact that Thailand was never really an ally of Japan. Honestly, we never talk about this, but in many ways, Thailand was occupied by Japan. But it also really reflects the US need to have friends in what was emerging as the post-World War II Cold War period. And so you saw this during the Act One I'm talking about. You saw this steady increase in US presence, US aid, US investment, US education in Thailand. But it was really put to the test in Act Two, which was the Vietnam War in the 1965 to 75 period, which Benjamin talks about as the very apex of the US-Thai 50-year alliance, and which he also mentions the pinnacle of which was President Johnson's visit here in October 66. And during that time, you had a legal underpinning, very kind of fragmented, the 1954 Manila Pact, SEATO, 1962 Tanat Rusk communique. But really, the facts on the ground were what? 88 bases, 8 US bases, 50,000 airmen here during the war, flying sorties against Vietnam and then, of course, later Cambodia and Laos. And what came at the end of Act Two in April 1975 was the fall of Laos and Cambodia and South Vietnam, these dominoes that potentially Thailand was going to be one of them, and the ignominious withdrawal of the United States. After all of that, with the Mayaguez debacle, where the US launched a rescue mission at the end of the Vietnam War to get the Mayaguez vessel back using Thai bases without permission from the government of Thailand. The result of that was the US was cordially asked to leave completely. The bases were returned back to their Thai sovereign owners, and the US disappeared. And Thailand established relations with China in November 1975. After all that, diplomatic relations. And so you have to wonder, where is the US going to be during this post-Act Two period? Well, Act Three came along, and that was the December 1978 invasion of Cambodia by Vietnam after 3+ years of the Khmer Rouge horror finally spilling across the borders. And interestingly, the Thai reaction to the Khmer Rouge spilling across the borders was to move the border back 20 kilometers. The Vietnamese reaction was to invade Cambodia. And when that happened, you had an ASEAN-led response to the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia because it was a Southeast Asian country crossing another border, regardless of all of the facts on the ground. And so ASEAN led the response to the Vietnamese invasion. And here was an opportunity for the US to come back into the region, not in a leading role, but rather following the ASEAN lead on the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia. And this all led, to be very, very quick in summary, to the Paris Peace Agreement in October 1991, where Cambodia was fine. Everything was fine. All the outside powers could walk away. It was fine. And guess what happened 2 months later? The Soviet Union collapsed. Cold War over. Now what? Now what are the bases for the US-Thai relationship? You've got a huge US presence here, which has been operating for decades. And when I arrived in 1988 as political counselor, my impression was this relationship is operating on fumes. It's operating on fumes, and especially after the settlement of the Cambodia crisis. And so where do you go from here? There was still, at that point, a comfort level on both sides based on all that time of the special relationship. And China was back, India was back, Europe was back, Japan was back, all those other players were back, which I would contest is normal. Nevertheless, there was still this sort of special comfort level on the US side and on the Thai side. And then came the Asian financial crisis. And in July 1997, I would say, this is the fulcrum. This is the fulcrum, because everything before July 1997 was special. And everything after that was guarded, not so sure, especially on the Thai side. Maybe the US side took a little bit for granted. We rushed back in a few months later after we didn't support the Thai in July when they went to the IMF. It seemed like every country in the world was part of that package except the US. And there's good reasons for that, which I can address if anybody's interested, but we didn't. And that's the fulcrum. And ever since that time, what you've had in the relationship has been the US, understandably, not happy with the military interventions that have happened a couple of times since then, had to express our values, but kind of in a very black and white fashion, and also not looking back, not really concerned about the implications for the special relationship. And so you have today a situation where the US has become the uncle that many of you in the room may know, who only shows up once or twice a year and criticizes everybody in the family about their clothing choices and their relationships, and then disappears and you don't see them again. Meanwhile, China is happily located right in the region, a couple of hours away. It shouldn't be something that we wring our hands about in the US. It's normal. It's normal. And so what we have today is a reversion to normalcy. But you look at the US Embassy, you look at the US footprint, it's huge. It's huge. And it's a vestige of the relationship I've just described. And I wonder, and I'll just close here, is that sustainable? Thank you.
Thank you, Skip. So I'm going to proceed now to Benjamin, who will bring us up to date on what's changed.
Thank you, Dominic. Can I be heard? Yes? Yeah. Thank you, Dominic, and good evening, and thank you, everyone, for coming. I should begin by just quickly saying for the record that while I work for the Asia Foundation, the views expressed here tonight and those in the book do not necessarily reflect those of the foundation or its donors. Otherwise, I'd like to begin with some words of thanks. Thanks to Ambassador Boyce for the long interview you granted me for the book back in 2015, for your patience these past 4 months as tonight's event was repeatedly postponed by Omicron, and for your insightful words this evening about the book and about the relationship. To Joe, for your time and contribution tonight. I'm looking forward to your response to what's been said so far. And to Dominic for keeping a place open on the club's schedule for this event and for revisiting your role as moderator from a few years back. And finally, a word of thanks to the many others who gave interviews for this project, the full listing of which is in the book, and several of whom have sadly died since its original publication. I had been in the US for only a day last November on my first trip back since the start of COVID, when I received the news of the passing of Bill Klausner. Over a long series of lunches spanning 13 years, I learned much from Bill about the US's role in Thailand, and even more about the kind of life I both did and did not want to lead here as a longtime expatriate. About my book, he wrote that it, quote, jostled the nerve endings to recall and reflect over 6 decades of events. And so, having missed his funeral 6 months ago, just a public word of thanks and remembrance for an old friend. I'll begin by talking about the book itself, as well as about some of the reactions to its first edition over the past several years. I'll then pivot to what's new in the second edition being launched this evening, and conclude with just a brief word on where I think we currently find the set of relationships in 2022. The idea for this book actually came about 10 years ago, when, as Amnesty International's Southeast Asia researcher, I became increasingly frustrated with the restriction that I could only advocate human rights on normative grounds, by which I mean I was only ever permitted to cite international laws, norms, and treaties when speaking with Thai officials, rather than refer to their national or professional interests. And yet, when officials make human rights decisions, they are not thinking only, if indeed at all, about international law, but also about their economy, their upcoming elections, their border security, political reputations, a whole host of other factors. And it seemed to me that this blinkered, almost fundamentalist approach to human rights advocacy was at best naive and at worst self-defeating. And it was this idea I originally pitched to Harvard Law School's Human Rights Program in January 2014, and might have stuck with for the book entirely had it not been for Thailand's coup 5 months later. For I saw in the United States' response to the coup a situation analogous to my frustrations at Amnesty, namely a response driven entirely by the letter of the law, in this case the U.S. Foreign Assistance Act, that requires the suspension of military aid in the event of a coup, and a response utterly devoid of context. In contrast to how Ambassador Boyce had handled Thailand's 2006 coup, which Wikileaks makes clear was nuanced, calibrated, and infused with knowledge of the country and its leadership, America's boilerplate language in 2014 made it appear ill-informed, disinterested, and even dismissive. More to the point, it was consequential. For alongside the paltry $3.5 million in suspended military aid, it was far too little to make a difference. Thailand would, as we all know, remain under military rule for nearly 5 years. And yet it was far too much to avoid severely damaging US-Thai relations. To be clear, my argument was not that the US should have ignored the coup, as it had done in Egypt the year before, but that it should have either worked to restore relations more swiftly, or, conversely, made Thailand pay a truly regrettable price for its forcible removal of an elected government. In other, more sporting terms, if you're going to foul an opposing player, knock him down and don't let him score in the process. Even just 10 years before, this might not have mattered, but by 2014, there was another country waiting to fill the void, the People's Republic of China. Indeed, the Obama administration's decision to hold America's many other foreign policy interests in Thailand hostage to its so-called foreign policy values allowed China to make a major play in the kingdom in the US's absence. At the same time, the 2014 coup actually marks the end of the book's first edition, not the beginning. So what was the book all about? It's about effectively how we got here, how it all came to this. The first part of the book documents what Skip has talked a lot about, namely Thailand's 20th century relations with the US and China, toward establishing on the one hand the incredible breadth and depth of the US-Thai alliance, and on the other, the arm's length, even adversarial Sino-Thai dynamic. What I found was that the US began taking its eye off the ball in Thailand, and China following it more closely as far back as the end of that century, with the financial crisis of 1997. And that the geopolitical shift referred to in the book's title began in earnest in 2001. That year, China's economy was at the low point of a 12-year period of between 8 and 14% economic growth, beginning its rise from a regional to a global power. That year, 3 hijacked planes destroyed the Twin Towers and part of the Pentagon, upending US foreign policy over the course of 90 deadly minutes and kicking off a forever war on terror. And that year, Thaksin Shinawatra was elected Prime Minister of Thailand, starting the country on a pro-Chinese path that none of his military or royalist successors has altered. The first edition then examines the shift by Thailand away from the US sphere of geopolitical influence and toward that of China. It does so over the course of 3 Chinese presidencies, 3 American presidencies, and 8 Thai premierships. And it does so in 7 distinct areas of Thailand's bilateral relations with the US and China, namely politics, diplomacy, economics, the military, the monarchy, governance, and the wider Mekong and ASEAN region. In doing so, the book reaches 2 conclusions regarding Thailand's geopolitical shift. One, that it is comprehensive, for it is strongly apparent in all 7 of those aforementioned areas. And 2, that its effect on the US and China has been zero-sum, whereby Chinese advances have spelled American retreats, Chinese gains at American expense. And the consequences of these conclusions are likewise twofold. First, from the standpoint of so-called foreign policy values, China's model of authoritarian capitalism has firmly and lastingly supplanted any seeds of American-inspired liberalism planted in Thailand during the 1990s. Liberalism defined as, yes, free and fair elections, but also as respect for human rights, the rule of law, transparency, and democratic governance. And second, from the standpoint of foreign policy interests, China has, to varying degrees, replaced the United States, a bilateral, multilateral, and non-NATO ally, as Thailand's first and foremost international partner, a status that perhaps means little in times of peace, but which will matter a great deal indeed when an armed conflict erupts in the South China Sea or Taiwan. While the book, whose final manuscript was submitted in late 2016, did not overtly assume or advocate a Hillary Clinton presidency, it did end with the express hope that the US pivot to Asia that Clinton had first articulated in 2008 might still come to pass, and that Thailand's shift might still be arrested or even reversed. A word then on how the first edition was received. I would like to tell you how it was received by my mother, except that upon picking it up and reading the acknowledgments to the very end where her name appeared, she promptly put it back down. My lovely wife Pianuch, on the other hand, who's here tonight, upon reading the first several chapters, remarked that it reminded her of Game of Thrones. So that should have been on the back cover, but is not. Most of the formal reviews and informal comments about the book were positive, but in my view, the critical ones are far more interesting and edifying. A not uncommon one, especially from readers similar to those in this room, noted that the book too often referred to Thai's positions rather than their full names. The impetus for this was a feeling that the general reader, a non-Thai specialist, might find the names confusing or distracting. But I can see how for the initiated, as it were, this could be frustrating. Another was that the book, in some places, risked overstating its case with its litany of facts and details. Yet in defense of that, I remind that I started writing the book in early 2014, at a time when its overall narrative and thesis was far outside the mainstream. My fear was that I would make too sweeping a statement with the book without the grounds to back it up. And having been trained as a litigator, I felt the need to marshal any and all admissible evidence. A somewhat contrary criticism, but a more serious one, is that the book was not inclusive enough of interviews with Chinese actors, but relied too heavily on Americans and Thais. And in this, I am guilty as charged. For while the list of interviews is long and includes 7 US or Thai ambassadors, 5 Thai foreign ministers, and 4 Thai prime ministers, including Thaksin Shinawatra in a terribly expensive London cafe with his bodyguards standing at the door, I do wish I had tried to get at least more Chinese academics, if not Chinese officials, on the record. Perhaps the best and most comprehensive critique of the book was written by the FCCT's own Chris Baker, most of whom most of you would know or at least know of. His review is worth the read, for while it takes issue with the book's, quote, Cold War terminology and framing, it does not in the least misrepresent or mischaracterize the analysis. And in that sense, aided as well by its appearance in the New York Review of Books, it validated the book's purpose, which was to add to the debate, or in Thailand's case, kick off a debate, concerning a particular theater of great power contestation. The title of his review says it all. Thailand is not lost. One final response that I'll mention, but won't be drawn out on, was that of an unnamed branch of the US intelligence community, which made its displeasure known to me directly with the book's use of the Wikileaks cables, which is to say of classified information. Yet my view was basically that, rightly or wrongly, the cables were in the public domain, that they had effectively been declassified, and to pretend otherwise would have been to score an own goal, especially when what they allowed me to do was essentially to say, don't take my word for it, but see the written record. Again, evidentiary value. That said, whatever you may think of Julian Assange and the US federal indictment against him, which was explicitly referenced by the intelligence service in its communication to me, or of the more general personal privacy versus public transparency debate, the cables did cause, as the book explains, real and lasting damage to the US-Thai relationship. My other more general defense, and this really informed the whole project, was, as quaint as it may sound, patriotism to me has always been able to assume many different forms, and that a good faith critique of bad policy, an absence of policy, or of good policy gone wrong is one of those forms. I was also clear from literally the first sentence in the book that I set out not to merely chronicle these relationships, but to analyze them, and that I was making no claim to objectivity, not least because as an American who has lived and worked in Thailand since 2002, I did not believe such objectivity was even possible. A final word then on the book's second edition and on where we find ourselves today. The second edition effectively picks up where the first one left off. Again, Thailand's 2014 coup. At the risk of scooping myself even further, I'll say less about this additional material, except that it revolves around three seminal events, all involving the heads of state of China, Thailand, and the US, that took place just 26 days apart in the fall of 2016. On October 13th, in Thailand, King Bhumibol Adulyadej, America's single most steadfast ally in Southeast Asia since World War II, and who had reigned for 70 years, passed away. In late October, in China, during a 4-day meeting of the Communist Party's top leadership, President Xi Jinping was named the nation's core leader, becoming the first since 2002 to receive the designation, and only the third since Mao. And on the 8th of November in America, Donald Trump, unintelligent, uninterested, and uninformed, was elected president of the world's largest economy and commander-in-chief of its largest military. Senior General turned Prime Minister Prayuth oversaw Thailand's royal succession and orchestrated its first elections since the coup. After 5 years, these polls allowed the US to save face in finally restoring full relations with Thailand, but only by having to hold its nose at the election's dubious rules and results. Xi Jinping, also not a new figure on the scene, had used the US absence to accelerate a Belt and Road initiative in Thailand barely mentioned in the book's first edition, and which had never been a purely economic strategy. Indeed, its military and Mekong aspects in particular have advanced accordingly. Giving credit where it is due, President Trump managed to succeed of a fashion where Obama had failed in reorienting American foreign policy away from the Middle East and toward East Asia, and in releasing a new free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. Even more importantly, he did so in the changed context of seeing China not as a cooperative partner, but as the peer competitor it had been since the late 2000s. Otherwise, however, as had until very recently been the case under Biden as well, Northeast Asia received the lion's share of attention. And under neither of these administrations' regional strategies has Thailand factored much at all. Thailand did not appear in Biden's interim national security guidance of March 2021, or on the itineraries of either Secretary of Defense Austin or Vice President Harris last July and August, respectively. Singapore and Vietnam appeared in all three. It did appear on Secretary of State Blinken's December 2021 itinerary, but revealing that the current administration appreciates the value of showing up no more than did the last, Thailand was removed after a journalist traveling with the secretary tested positive for COVID. Put on a mask, request a 20-foot-long Vladimir Putin-style table, and hold your meeting. And in the Biden administration's own iteration of the Indo-Pacific strategy, released this past February, Thailand's three mentions all come among matter-of-fact listings of America's Asian treaty allies. At the same time, and I will end here, it is increasingly unclear what Thailand itself has to offer. In contrast to its foreign ministry for literally a half century, from Tanat Koman to Kasit Pirom, when Thailand successfully navigated the Cold War, served as ASEAN's unofficial leader on the mainland, and managed the rise of China, its chief geopolitical ambition today essentially consists of not wanting to be seen as having one. A failing state next door, a dying Mekong River, and a static South China Sea. Where is Thailand? And most recently, a war in Ukraine. Indeed, for the past 3 months, Thailand's reaction to the first invasion of a sovereign nation with a clear intention of annexing it since 1941 has been to proclaim a policy of neutrality. As the US rightly attempts to close ranks against an unlawful war being conducted unlawfully on NATO's doorstep, Thailand's position as one of only 4 major non-NATO allies in the entire Indo-Pacific is a practical impediment, a diplomatic affront, and a national disgrace. Not coincidentally, the position is consistent with that of China as well. And so for the first time since starting the book 8 years ago, a book whose unofficial subtitle might as well read Thailand Matters, I confess to wondering sometimes whether indeed Thailand really does matter. Or perhaps more accurately, whether the ways in which it matters are remediable or reclaimable. Its most important and immutable fact is that it sits directly between the Indian and Pacific Oceans, at the geographical heart of this newly christened region, even as its politics and policies continue to move away from the West and in a decidedly northern direction. The real test will come, as it always does, when the waters east of Thailand go from warm to truly hot. For it is then and there that the game-changing consequences of Thailand's geopolitical shift will be made clear and present. Thank you.
Well, Thank you, Benjamin. Two American perspectives. We'll now go to Joe, who will take us to Beijing and inside the BRA beltway, as it were.
Thank you very much, Dominic. Really delighted to be here tonight, and it's a true honor to be sharing the floor with Skip and Benjamin. I would like to agree very much with both Benjamin and Skip on their points regarding the US's kind of lack of engagement. You can call it neglect and distraction. We've seen it, and it's increased over the decades, and that is undeniable. I think it's also important to view that in the backdrop of an increase in what I think is a generational shift in what one could say towards an Asian century. And Asia is house to a lot of big, great, rich countries, and so as a group, I think Asia is growing up and it's graduating, it's maturing, and I think the U.S. and the West in general is going to have to get used to the fact that it no longer, as was quoted in your book, provides an excellent example to others. It was the case 25 years ago, or I think this was a quote. Was it Prem? I can't remember who. Bush, Samak to Bush, right? Samak quoted to Bush. But fast forward till today, a lot has happened in the West to erode this kind of good example. A lot has happened in Asia that has led to new models, new thinking, new kind of considerations to be taken. And I think in that backdrop, the West is going to have to learn how to engage going forward. And I don't think it's a case where you have just 4 acts. I think there are another 4 that are yet to come between US and Thailand. But the back 4 will have to be under these new kind of conditions. You ask in the book, you make the point that China is a challenge to the rules-based order, and I would actually like to question that. Is really China the one that is challenging the rules-based order? I've been, you mentioning you want to get quotes from Chinese academics and officials. They're telling me that they're very worried now about this kind of complete abandon of the rules-based order that was set up after the Second World War, displayed by the West. So, I mean, it's in this context that I think the Acts 5, 6, 7, and 8 will be played out. Thankfully for the U.S., China too has a lot of work to do. It too has to up its game. The Belt and Road Initiative is going through its 4th iteration of iterational improvement. It first started off with just a concept, and then it became formalized into a kind of a strategy or an initiative, they called it. And then they cleaned it up. They improved on it because they realized it wasn't working very well, and so they made it. They tried to make it cleaner. They tried to make sure that they couldn't be accused of debt traps, and they wanted to make it green. And so that was an iteration. And of late, the BRI is much more low-key. You might have noticed. You can, count the number of times that BRI is mentioned. Significantly less. It's not that they're doing less; they're just talking about it less. So, BRI, obviously, the reason why it's going through all these iterations is because these iterations are required of it, because it wasn't working that well. And also another thing that the Chinese are, much less good at building is the soft infrastructure. They're excellent at building hard infrastructure, not so good at the soft. And not so good at preparing the ground for this massive build-out. There are for example, no Chinese schools. I'm not talking about a school that teaches Chinese. I'm talking about a school that teaches you physics and biology in Chinese, in such a way that you can take the Chinese Gaokao from Bangkok and you can, go from grade 7 to grade 8, and grade 9 back here again. Every other country that has a successful international, Singapore, 2, 3 schools already in Bangkok. The Chinese don't have a single one. And so until they really realize that these are things that are required, BRI is still going to go through a lot of pain, unnecessarily, actually. Another point. Can I have a show of hands, please? Who amongst you are from a mainland Chinese publication? Point made.
There's one. We got one.
One? Okay. Congratulations. And often the failures that we see with BRI are not strategy failures. They're micro level failures. The failures at the operational level, failures to take into account really simple things that could be easily solved, and that has an effect on straining relationships. So it's. And China has also been changing in the last, since BRI was first announced till today. China also has evolved in its own political standing and its own positions, and so it's no longer communist in name only. Another quote from your book. China does have to step up its game. That being said, China will remain a formidable foe to the US and the West in general, especially the US. It's more present, it's here, it's Asian, it's engaged. It's engaged because this region matters to them. And it's still, despite all these challenges to growth that we've seen in the past few months, even a couple of years, it's still a region that's growing fast. It has many problems that it has to solve, but it's still an extremely fast and dynamic, creative, innovative country. It's more combative as well, more assertive. And so it's not a place that will be as easily just brushed aside by a couple of state visits by senior US politicians. That's no longer what it will take to sway partners, even great and good friends like Thailand. It will take a lot more than just Blinken and the president. Will he show up at APEC? Will the Chinese president show up at APEC? I mean, these are things that of course will matter, but China is not going to be an easy foe to replace. Now, the big question that I have, and it's really for the floor as well, is that now we have this COVID reset, and the COVID reset is not over. We're still in the middle of this reset. What will happen to U.S., China, Thailand on the other end of this COVID reset is still very much up in the air. It's unclear, whether as of right now, I don't think anyone really has particularly good visibility. All we know is that it is very important. It is, especially in China, where it is having a very deep impact on its own economy, on its position in the world. China is hasn't been present for a long time in the region. I mean, sure, we haven't had a U.S. ambassador for a while, but the Chinese are not meeting people that often. So we have a similar situation. What will happen at the end of this is really going to be, I think, the most exciting kind of act for the next 20 years to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joe. Skip, I was very interested by your observation that the fulcrum for the shift was 1997, when basically the IMF came in and took over, and there was a feeling amongst Thais at that time that they were being treated rather as children, and that they brought the disaster upon themselves. And there was another event that followed that some years later, which was, of course, was Wikileaks. And the last time I discussed it with you, you told me that you weren't, in fact, allowed to read the Wikileaks because as the head of Boeing in Southeast Asia, you weren't allowed to read illegally procured documents, something that Benjamin just mentioned. How much damage do you think the Wikileaks saga did to the Thai-American relationship? Did it really bang the nails in the coffin?
I think WikiLeaks in general, worldwide, made people say, gosh, the US foreign policy is exactly what they were saying. The things that US diplomats and senior officials were talking about is exactly what they were putting out publicly. This was not the Pentagon Papers. And people said, you know, these cables show that US diplomats are engaged, involved, articulate, witty, have good contacts, etc. But the downside, in Thailand especially, was that our dear friends who had these conversations with us were apparently, in some cases, astonished to find out that they were being reported. And they were, in fact, being reported as examples of our understanding of what was going on, never imagining that they were going to become public. So the damage was that these cables all became public. But the good news is that there was no secrecy, there was no hidden agenda. Everything that we reported, the conversations that we had, really reflected what was going on at the time. And the things that the US government was saying about our worldwide foreign policy in places like Thailand and every place else were exactly what we were discussing confidentially. I do not support the revelation of the WikiLeaks cables, as you can imagine. It's been a real problem for many of us. But there was this element that showed that what we said at the time was what we were doing.
Just to follow on quickly, the betrayal of confidentiality.
No, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's the problem.
But
the problem is you have a conversation where someone reveals to you things that they are considering or saying or know. You report them back and you apply a certain level of confidentiality or even more, the levels that we use, that the government, not we, US government used to uses. Whatever verb is important here. Anyway, and the reason is we were trying to, and we are trying to, and every government tries to make sure that conversations that are had in confidence with loyal and truthful and good informed friends are protected. That's all. And the WikiLeaks blew that all asunder.
Benjamin, when you talk about Thailand's place in the world and how it exerts foreign policy and applies it, a very important consideration is that it is part of ASEAN. And one of the purposes of ASEAN is to give the region an enhanced voice, a shared platform. And of course, in the period that we're discussing, we have seen ASEAN actually fall apart. So that, for example, on Myanmar, we have completely different positions in different parts of the country. Can you give us a handle on that? How much we can talk about America and Chinese, these are very personal relationships. China is a motherland in many ways to Thailand. America is Thailand's oldest ally, but the implosion of ASEAN, how has that affected the whole picture?
Well, I think that the diversity of ASEAN has been there from the start. Right, Thailand helped establish ASEAN in 1967. In many respects, there is no part of the world, I think, that has that is more diverse than the 10 ASEAN states, looked at from any angle, topographically, linguistically, ethnically, religiously. I mean, ask yourself what the average, let's say, Catholic Philippine diplomat has in common, right? Surrounded by water in the middle of the Pacific, has in common with your average Buddhist Myanmar diplomat who's bordering China and India, right? I mean, it's been largely a political construct from the beginning. I think the problem and the issue comes in that Thailand has ceded essentially its unofficial leadership in mainland Southeast Asia of ASEAN. It's always been Thailand on the mainland and Indonesia in the maritime sphere. And what we've seen in Myanmar, for example, the crisis you just mentioned, but we're also seeing on the Mekong River, for example, Thailand under the Thaksin Shinawatra administration in 2003 founded the ACMEX Forum, right? The Irrawaddy Chao Phraya Mekong cooperation, economic cooperation strategy, right? As a means through which to govern the river and the economic subregion through which the river runs. And yet, despite having resuscitated ACMEX in 2018, the current government has really not exerted any kind of leadership. We're finding a leadership vacuum. The same can be said in 2019, I believe, was when Thailand had its chair of ASEAN. I think it was 2019. Thailand was its most recent chair of ASEAN. And Thailand's job at that time was essentially to marshal through a response by ASEAN to the U.S. free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, the result of which was the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific strategy, which, if you've read, is an incredibly anodyne document, right? And yet, if you talk to Thai officials, they'll tell you we had the Chinese looking over our left shoulder, the Americans looking over our right, and the best we could do was essentially the least common denominator, which contains important issues like taking care of marine debris and cleaning up the seas, and certain things that are important but are expressly sort of non-controversial. So I don't think the issue is that ASEAN has been falling apart on account of under its own weight, or because the crisis it's faced in the past several years have been beyond its capacity to manage. It's because there's been a vacuum of leadership that I think Thailand is the most guilty of. And you mentioned Myanmar. I mean, there's no country in ASEAN that has a greater stake in a stable Myanmar than does Thailand, with its porous border and a history of contention, across that border. And yet, when that crisis broke out in February of 2021, Thailand's approach, whether it be to making a statement within or outside of ASEAN, whether it meant nominating an envoy, a Thai envoy, to be ASEAN's envoy to the country, its response has essentially been that of someone in the back of the classroom who simply hopes he's not going to get called on, right? Who just keeps his head down, picks lint off his shirt, and hopes that the teacher calls on someone else. That would not have happened under Surin Pitsuwan as foreign minister of Thailand in the 1990s. It would not have happened under Surikiart, who was Thaksin's first foreign minister. It would not have happened under Kasit Pirom, who was Episit's foreign minister. But the past 10 years, you've seen a foreign ministry that is essentially a glorified messenger service for the First Army, and that has been disempowered in terms of any kind of policy-making ability.
Joe, you mentioned the COVID reset. So we've had this incredibly disruptive period. We're now going through another very disruptive period with the Ukraine situation, and people are being asked to take sides. This is a huge fly in the ointment internationally. How does it affect the topic we're discussing? Where does it come in?
Let me start with Ukraine first, because that's a bit easier. I don't actually think Ukraine is having a huge impact on Sino-Thai, at the very least, relations. I think the Thais don't have particularly big relations with either Ukraine nor Russia in terms of commercial side. They came out on the side of, I think they're rightly so, on the side of condemning Russia for the invasion, but there was actually a lot of debate internally on whether that should have been the position or should they have abstained. So Thailand, I think, is we're comfortable where they are now. China wants to walk the middle path as much as it can. The Chinese people are divided pretty much on actually neither of them support Ukraine nor Russia. The ones supporting Russia are actually more anti-NATO US encroachment, and the ones supporting Ukraine are supporting the concept that you shouldn't have two sovereign nations invading each other. And so you do have a split in public opinion, which is actually making it quite difficult for the government to kind of, it also limits their ability to really take one side or another, and the government would very much like to stay kind of abstained and out of it. And the West keeps on coming to China and saying, hey, you need to come out and condemn and more and everything. The Europeans come, and they show up the Chinese, and then the Chinese, well, understandably, they're irritated. I mean, China in March imported 9 billion yuan, I believe, from Russia, all in. That's what the EU imports in 2 days. I mean, who is the one really supporting the Putin regime? So, and the Chinese are good at math, they can count. So, it's an uncomfortable situation for the Chinese. They would very much like to stay out of it. And, again, as I mentioned, their relations, their commercial relations with Russia is smaller than their commercial relations with Thailand, Malaysia, and countries in the region. So that's regarding Ukraine. I think on COVID, it is really still too early to tell. We were hoping, I was personally hoping that, following a relatively good experience they had with, they had this Olympic bubble, and the Chinese came away from that with a lot of lessons on how, because within the bubble, there was no quarantine. And they were studying how, people who got infected others and everything. It was quite a positive reaction after that. Then, and there was rumors like, oh, they're going to open it up first to businessmen. We first have to have our, annual meeting, but after that we'll open it up quickly. And then Hong Kong hit, and Hong Kong was the thing that changed everyone's minds, and rightly so. If you prorate the death rate in Hong Kong, which was, by the way, Omicron, so this whole idea that Omicron is fine. If you prorate the death rate in Hong Kong to China, it's 50,000 deaths a day, accumulating in 1.5 million in 6 weeks. That is unacceptable to anyone. And so you ask, should they open up? And given that China has a similar problem to Hong Kong in that the elderly are not vaccinated, and it's very difficult to convince an 85-year-old Chinese person to do anything. And the medical resources of China are a fraction of what they are in Hong Kong, right? So, can you blame them for not opening up? That being said, there is a failure in imagination on behalf of the authorities, well, on behalf of many people, but to think that there is no other way between what they're doing now and opening up. I mean, there's a whole spectrum of things that they can learn from neighboring countries, from rich and poor, big and small, who have done many things that could easily ease the situation without degenerating. So there is a certain failure in imagination on that front, and that same failure of imagination is going to continue, I believe, right now, the way it looks, until something very major will have to change from very high up for any real change to be. So at this moment, it's not looking like the opening up will be anytime soon. But will they be more amenable to maybe finding a middle way? That could be done. And let's not forget, there is a cost. There is a real cost of total lockdown, of dynamic zero, they call it, and a real human cost. I mean, people die because of dynamic zero, because they're denied access to healthcare and dialysis, blood transfusions, all these really basic things that elderly people and sometimes not elderly people need and are denied because as a result of the lockdown. So there is a real human cost to it, which needs to be internalized, and it currently is an externality.
Right, we have a microphone in the middle of the room for anybody who'd like to ask a question. Paul's on the move.
I'm Paul Waddell, a former journalist. Is this on?
It is on.
Okay.
Former club president.
In addition to COVID, another set of events that has changed how some people view China has been the events in Hong Kong and the arrests and the changes in the government. And for young Thais, particularly those who are concerned about the long-term authoritarian government here, how are they viewing that process in Hong Kong? And how does that impact the recent gains that China has made, particularly among the older and the Sino-Thais here?
Me? Yeah. What? You go first?
No, go ahead.
I actually don't think very much. I don't think it's the young Thais or the Thais in general are particularly concerned about what happens in Hong Kong. I happen to be aware of certain campaigns to raise awareness and raise funds and raise support for the Hong Kong initiative, the students, and I was actually incredibly surprised by how little traction it got. I would have thought, like your question, I was asking the same question, and I was actually really surprised by how little. It's one aspect. Maybe it was a bad, poorly done campaign, but I was actually in a position to actually see what went on in that particular campaign, and it was actually surprisingly by magnitude, 2 zeros fewer than I thought they would be. Yeah, which was surprising to me.
Yeah, I would add, I think that the primary challenge that Thailand's still sort of nascent, genuine pro-democracy movement has is that it simply doesn't have the numbers. It simply doesn't have the numbers. You compare, that demographic with, as you say, the older sort of Sino-Thai. The older Sino-Thai are much larger demographically and have a lot more political and economic power. Yeah. So, moreover, I would argue, yes, there is the Milk Tea Alliance. I mean, I'm not even on social media a whole lot in English, much less in Thai, but you do hear of the Milk Tea Alliance, and there being some sense of solidarity between and among Thais and Hong Kong citizens vis-a-vis what with the squeeze that's being put on them by the Chinese, by the mainland Chinese. But at the same time, my understanding of the democracy movement here is that it is far more focused on domestic politics than it is on the international scene. I mean, it's a bit of a luxury in some ways to be looking at the Hong Kong situation and trying to apply it to Thailand when, you're being water cannoned on the street in Bangkok. It's far away, both literally and figuratively, I think, to most pro-democracy Thais.
But if I may add to that, because you mentioned the Milk Tea Alliance. Milk Tea Alliance is a very good example of a home goal. Own goal? To use your own goal, right? Own goal. Yeah. Of an own goal by the Chinese team. That was, that really, it was a nothing thing that led to an alliance across three places, right? And over a nothing, and completely own gold by the Chinese side because of this lack of finesse and lack of understanding and lack of engagement, the lack of the soft stuff that I was mentioning earlier.
But if China is putting itself forward as a new model, one in which government is orderly and economic growth is strong, that new model must at least have some questions raised by Hong Kong, which was thriving well before and for many years as a key manufacturing and business and financial hub for the region, and now is taking some backward steps.
But again, in the case of Hong Kong, you have a populace that staged the Umbrella Revolution in 2014 that I think is just a population that is far more politically exercised and politically active than Thailand is. The 1973-76 generation is in its elderly years at this point. Young people, there are exceptions, and you see them on the street. But again, from a numbers standpoint, they're simply not there. I don't know where they are at the moment, right? I mean, as COVID begins to lift, the numbers come down. One would expect they may come back, and who knows whether this past weekend's election is a harbinger of some more activist sentiment coming to the fore. But I just think in Hong Kong you have, perhaps because they've lived under the Chinese, the mainland cloud for so long, you have a populace that is simply much more committed to retaining and maintaining the democratic rights that they've had since before 1997, and certainly were promised after 1997. Whereas, Thailand I described in my book essentially as a land without ideology. Other than an ill-defined royalism, which can be anything to anyone at any given time, it is not a place in which either communism, democracy, or any other ism, or form of ideology or government is adhered to on principle so much as for pragmatic purposes.
On the model of China, China does have a model. There is this China model. But I don't think that they're pushing it. They're kind of going to places saying, hey, Thailand, do the China model. I think there's this impression that China does that. I don't think China believes that they're doing that. And they're not, so I don't think they're actually even concerned about this question. I don't think even ever made it to the to the discussion when discussing what to do on Hong Kong. I don't think this ever made it in the discussion, because promoting the China model, exporting the China model in the same way America would export the American model is not something which I think is particularly high yet on the Chinese agenda.
Right, question.
Peter Trainer, I'm a club member. Question mainly for Benjamin. You ended your first book emphasizing the significance and the importance of the Southern Canal across Thailand, but you haven't mentioned that at all this evening. Is that because over the last 5 or 6 years it's decreased in significance, or do you still feel it's important, as particularly with the world impacts on international trade because of COVID and of Ukraine, the seaways, the effect on China, the impact on the Thai Navy, and all the rest of it? Is it still a significant factor?
I think you've touched on it in that the past several years, in particular, with the disruption of supply chains and just the whole sort of arresting of international trade, the issue has gone into abeyance. But there was a period, and I do cover this in the afterword of the book that makes up much of the second edition as distinct from the first edition, that in 2017 and 18, I believe, and even into 2019, there was quite a bit of discussion within the Thai government on reconsidering the idea of a canal in various options, a canal, a land bridge, something along that southern narrow isthmus that would allow China to continue. And I say China because it was the Chinese that were really advocating this through their under the BRI rubric, something that would allow the Chinese to continue to diversify east and west and north and south, the various ways and means of linking their landlocked southwestern part of their country to the warm waters of the Andaman Sea and the Bay of Bengal, right? I mean, southern Yunnan province and the whole southwestern part of the country does not have direct access to those waters, and they know that makes them vulnerable in the event of a crisis or an armed conflict. And so, China has essentially been diversifying its ways and means of getting there through the Chakpyu port and road in Myanmar, through Bangladesh, but also working with Thailand to find various ways, whether it be by rail, whether it be by road, even the Mekong River, which of course only runs north to south and empties into the Gulf of Thailand, but various ways and means of ensuring that the connectivity is there, such that if and when an armed conflict kicks off, it isn't entirely hostage to the Strait of Malacca, which is narrow and increasingly clogged on account of the number and the volume of ships going through there. I also think, interestingly enough, and I wouldn't have thought of this at all 8 years ago when I started writing the book, but climate change has made the Arctic so much more of a viable option for the movement of goods and energy, both to and from China, in a way that, again, 8 years ago, sadly, we would not have been thinking of that. So I think it's a combination of yes, the sort of COVID moment that we're in that has thrown a wrench into the best blue sky planning, but also some changes on the geopolitical scene and the climate scene as well.
So anyway, the Krah Canal's been around for 400 years, so we won't count it out yet.
I know you've been a public skeptic to my public believer for a long time, Dominic. So yeah, we'll leave it there.
Right, Panu.
Hi, Panu Bongchum, the current president of the FCCT. I have two questions, one from myself and one from another past president, Jonathan Head. My question is to both of you. We talk about great power rivalries, China, US, and of course Thailand. This is the sort of the ground. But Thailand, incoherent, response in foreign policy in the past several decades has really not, showed that Thailand is serious about a foreign policy direction, especially in the current government. Great example is the China high-speed rail that, you have the Prime Minister promising that will happen, and it hasn't happened. What do you make of this in sort of the great power rivalry going forward? And also, as a follow-up on that, you mentioned that, okay, the pro-democracy groups doesn't have the numbers here, but it seems that increasingly Thailand is shifting, that foreign policy is becoming more mainstream because of some of these conversations in the past few years. What do you think that will play out going forward with the China and US relationship with Thailand?
I think, okay. I think the problem that we have right now, with like the railroad and I give me a little minute because I'd like to say it in a way that doesn't get me into trouble. But I don't think that what we see now today is actually a lack of engagement vis-a-vis the railroad. Like the railroad, for all intents and purposes, is a success because you have this kind of groundbreaking and really kind of like land-changing kind of railroad, which is the Sino-Lao one, which is already going. You can actually transport goods to China right now, today, from Thailand to China on that railroad. Not very fast. Lots of kind of hiccups along the way. I think the last test trial run took 9 days. So don't transport fresh fruit. That being said, I mean, the actual trail, it's the problems at the ports, which is why a lot of waiting around, not because the rail is very slow. Thailand actually has a rail right now from up to all the way up to Nong Khai. It's a freight rail, but the Sino-Lao rail is mainly a freight rail anyhow. So for all intents and purposes, we have one. We have the rail. It is there. It's a success. Well, in that we can now send products all the way from Thailand up to China. So whether that was a deliberate strategy by the government or that it just happened that way, I can't comment. I can't comment. But the fact is that Thailand now has an additional logistics route. And of course, they should invest on a transshipment center, but that's a very cheap investment. So we already have that. And whether we need to then, on top of that, build another $20 billion railroad to make it a little bit faster, then that's a question for someone else. But as of today, I think this rail is working.
Yeah, I might just add two things. I think your question speaks to two main points. One is that the delays that the rail has suffered from in some ways are evidence that Thailand has more leverage vis-a-vis the Chinese than most of its other mainland Southeast Asian neighbors. Laos has none. Cambodia doesn't exercise what it has. Myanmar is a different story altogether. And Vietnam, of course, has had historically a long and adversarial relationship with the Chinese. But the Thais have the best, comprehensively speaking, the best relationship with the Chinese of all of mainland Southeast Asia. And that's partly because it's the most mature relationship. It's hardly equal, but it is more equal than any of the other 4 countries in the region. And it's been able to exert that leverage rather, through some measures of pushing back, right? When the Chinese wanted land on either side of the rail line, Thailand cited decades-old laws that were initially put in place to keep Chinese from taking land in Thailand, and cited those laws as a means to prevent that from happening. They've been able to leverage technology transfer from the Chinese. They've been able to refinance the rail in such a way that more of the ownership is indigenous, as opposed to, it's never going to be debt trap diplomacy in Thailand anyway, but to lessen any danger of it being too much in the hands of the Chinese. On the other hand, and this is the other main point, China plays a very long game. And while I take Joe's point about how there is a rail in place, for the high-speed rail to succeed at its aim, which is to link southern China to Singapore, basic geography will tell you if there isn't a link through Thailand, the whole thing is, it's got to go through Malaysia as well, which Mahathir did a fairly good job of renegotiating a few years ago. But without the Thailand link, it doesn't serve its purpose. And its purpose is, and this is what I often feel like that China analysts too often forget, and I mentioned this briefly in my formal remarks, and that is that very seldom are Chinese economic initiatives purely economic. That there's a geopolitical element, even and especially to economic initiatives that do not promise a strong economic return. And I think for that reason, China's going to play a very long game and will eventually get its high-speed rail through Thailand.
Thank you. Just a question from Jonathan.
Right.
To Benjamin. Do you think Biden has crippled any attempt to raise the US game in this region by talking about alliance of democracies? That if he abandoned this clash of ideologies, he would have more flexibility to find common ground with Southeast Asia countries?
I mean, Thailand, quite notably, was not invited, right, to the Summit of Democracy in, was it February this year? February this year, I think. But my own sense, and maybe other journalists who are covering domestic Thai politics would have a better sense than I, but that it didn't cause a lot of ructions within the Thai establishment. That it was seen as kind of an American project that was to the side of what Thailand is trying to do here. The Americans did, as I mentioned, recognize the results of the 2019 elections, deeming them sufficient to qualify as a return to democracy and thus to restore full relations. So it wasn't entirely clear to me that it caused any ructions within the Thai establishment, and moreover that it was to Thailand's benefit to have been part of that. I mean, they've gotten what they want. Attending that summit may have placed implicit further obligations on them, which again I don't think is really what Thailand wants to be faced with. So I'm not sure that the focus on sort of a league of democracies in Southeast Asia has an expressly negative or positive effect.
Right, I can see 3 questions, so let's go through them.
Okay, excuse me, can you hear me? Could I just start off, Dominic, by asking, is it possible to ask everybody here, how many of you have ever done a DNA test? How many of you have ever done a DNA test? Could we check?
Not many.
I just say that because I had a shock some years ago. I did a DNA test. I'm Irish by nationality, but I ended up being 40% by German. Now, nothing wrong with that, but it was a bit of a surprise. Now, why do I say that? FCCT. What exactly does F mean? If we all dig down far enough into our roots, we may end up discovering we actually came from the same place. But anyway, that's my overall point.
It's a digression. We'll have a question now.
The question is this one, and it's to Mr. Boyce, and by the way, thank you all for your excellent speeches. I know that Joe Biden is Catholic. He takes every possible opportunity to tell us he's a Catholic. We know the religion of every Supreme Court justice. It's all over the news. We hear daily the rantings and ravings of the left and right on the US on Roe versus Wade, about all religious lines. And now Nancy Pelosi can't have Holy Communion in a Californian church. So here's the question. Good. If the USA continues down this road of turning the White House and the different branches of power, the Senate, Congress, and SCOTUS, into partisan religious squabbling institutions, how do you think this will affect the attitude of a China, a Russia, or even a rapidly growing secularized Europe to cooperate and work together with the USA? A country, some would argue, is fast moving to be to Christianity what Afghanistan is to fundamentalism in Muslim religion.
So Skip, I see you're keen to answer this question.
Yeah, I will answer this question. I need a phone, I guess, basically. I need a phone to read my answer. Or no. Maybe I just say my DNA test shows me being 100% Irish. But my nationality is 100% American. And I don't apologize for any of the crap that's going on right now, but I don't understand your question.
Right. Well, I think you've had a pretty good crack, actually. So be quick.
The second part of it is, do you think that intra-Christian conflict between evangelicals, Catholics, Methodists within the US is eventually going to come to a point where the Supreme Court, you can see all the stuff that's going on, where eventually the world will say, this isn't a country that we can deal with because it depends what religion the president is?
Yeah, no, I finally see a point here. I see a point, which is the direction that the US is going in right now is impossible. It's impossible for anybody to follow, whether it's internationally or domestically. It's very, very loaded. It's very, very difficult. And the issues of the last week or 10 days, frankly, make it impossible to answer your question with a very, impressive American response. Because you know what, America's in crisis these days, and everybody understands that. And if an American stands up and says that we're not in crisis, then you have to move on to another American.
Right, now let's move along. Julian.
Julian Spindler, club member. One observation, the reason why ASEAN is in the process of collapsing, partly due to China, because China has colonized at least 2 of the ASEAN countries, Cambodia and Laos, and Myanmar is on the edge of one way or the other. So that hasn't helped ASEAN at all. My question sort of takes objection to Benjamin's idea that democracy is, the forces of democracy in Thailand are insufficient to affect any significant change in the near future. I think that's what I read from what you said. And I would say that the next 12 months will challenge that statement very, very severely. Thailand, over the next 12 months, is entering into one of the most important periods in its modern history, and the current power structure will face its most serious challenges during this period. And I wonder what all 3 of you would think the impact will be of a democratic or a significantly more democratic Thailand on the US-China paradigm.
Okay, so can we Be quick in our
Yeah, I'll
answers.
take a quick crack at that. I mentioned during the previous remarks that Thaksin Shinawatra had placed Thailand on its pro-China trajectory, and I mentioned that none of his sort of royalist or military successors had altered that, and neither, obviously, did any of his nominees, Samak Somchai and his sister Yingluck. So my overall feeling, and I don't know the pro-democracy movement well enough to say this with 100% certainty, but I don't see any. I see the Thailand's political divisions and divides being extremely pronounced and important from a domestic standpoint, but not having an appreciable effect on its foreign policy. I don't think a more democratically elected or democratically focused government would alter Thailand's foreign policy in such a way that would contradict the overall trend and trajectory that I outlined in the book.
I'd agree with that.
Skip.
Well, I think that the Bangkok governor election over the weekend shows that the body politic, certainly in Bangkok, is fed up with the status quo, and that does not bode well for a continuation of the situation as it is. And whether that means U.S. or China or whatever, it certainly means that I think Thailand is headed in the next, I think as Julian says, in the next 12 months for a reckoning.
Great. Mix, can you make sure the kitchen doesn't close? Nick, your question.
On that point.
Hi, Nick Bernhardt here. I have a research company here in Southeast Asia, and I'm on the board of the FCCT as well. Benjamin, I will first confess that I have not yet read your book, but I've bought a copy already, and I'm very excited to do so. My question is inspired by Joe's introduction, where you mentioned some of China's lack of, say, soft foreign policy skills. Particularly, you mentioned, for example, the lack of international schools and other institutions that are needed. The way you said that made me feel that this is not the first time you've thought about it or have expressed it to others. So I'm very interested to hear what you have seen that shows China's attitudes towards those ideas, and also what actions it's taking to change that. And I'm also very interested to hear that from the other side, from the two of you, maybe taking a look in a more opposing situation where sometimes you see things as more threatening just by being there. So I'm very interested to hear all three of your comments on that question. Thank you.
I work a lot with Chinese companies coming to Thailand, Thai companies going to China, and so I have, firsthand experience dealing with a lot of the growth pains of China coming abroad, and it's natural. They've only just started doing it. It's normal to not be particularly good at it in your first decade. They are learning very fast. Not yet on the schools. I try every time new ambassador comes, I try and pitch the idea that they need to build schools here, and they always go, we have 1 million Thais learning Chinese. I said, excellent. But BRI will only work when the 45-year-old star of the company is willing to move here with his family, because right now the star is faced with a dilemma. Either he leaves his wife in China and kid in China, right? And he comes to Thailand alone, in which case lots of things can happen when he comes alone to Thailand, right? Or he brings his wife and child with him, and the child is then unable to reintegrate the Chinese education system. It is. I did Chinese education, my kids did the Chinese education. So you skip it for 2 years, there's no way you're getting back in. It's just very fast, very intense. So if he brings his child here, his child might be an excellent student in China, becomes an average student in international school, and unable to reintegrate the Chinese system later. And so these excellent, middle managers are faced with this dilemma. And so what do they choose? Neither. They stay. And that's what China's lacking. So they need this army of people who are willing to come out. For that, they need to build 5 schools in Thailand, another 5 in India, Japan. All these places that they have BRI ambitions, they need to be building Chinese schools. And that's just one example. You have, the use of lawyers, the use of consultants. All these things right now are incredibly difficult to do because of the internal structures of the Chinese state-owned enterprises, especially, where it's just easier to not hire anyone than to hire and have to explain why this, excellent law firm costs so much, and everyone is wondering whether you took a kickback. It's just not worth it for the manager. They just say, you know what, I just used the internal counsel, who by the way, not only doesn't read Thai, but hardly reads English. And so you have a lot of these kind of growing pains, which are normal. They're learning fast. And, I think the next decade will be better than this one. But we've been very active in trying to help them. So we have a good record. The companies we have advised have all had extremely successful experiences in Thailand. Ben mentions one of them in his book, the acquisition of ACL Bank by ICBC Bank. We were sell-side advisor on that one, and it's an excellent deal. And so, we try and make sure that the experiences of the Chinese companies in Thailand, but also in Europe, because we also help them in going into Europe, are successful ones.
So just to clarify, you do see that changing, say, in the next 10 years? Where
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Definitely.
Thank you.
Right. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, a quick point. I mean, Joe is quite right to point out the lack of sort of politically agnostic schools or entities, institutions that are run by the Chinese but are not politically sort of infused with anything from China itself. On the other side of the equation, there are more Confucius institutes, for example, in Thailand than there are in the rest of mainland Southeast Asia combined. Now, again, those are largely Mandarin language training schools and other institutions for teaching Chinese culture, as opposed to, as you said, biology and mathematics or what have you. But those do exist along with a host of Thai-Chinese cultural institutions. But from just basically a soft power standpoint, broadly speaking, with the exception of Huawei phones, and people tell me their new handsets are apparently as competitive with the Samsung and iPhone handsets, except for that product. When you look at social media, it's Facebook and not was it? WeChat, I think, is the Chinese one. I mean, movies are American, music is American, styles are American. Education aspirations, for the most part, of Thais are to study in the States for higher education as opposed to China. So I do think, while I take Joe's point that it's improving and likely will continue to improve over 10 years, the next 10 years, when you look at soft power, sort of broadly speaking, that's one area in which it's not one of the 7 areas I examined in the book, in part because it would have been the exception to the rule.
Right. I can see Sam and Tom, so if you come forward and ask questions quickly.
Thank you. Sam Wright, club member. I'm surprised not to hear any comments on this delicate balance between the two powers on the demographic warfare that is taking place and has been taking place for decades, and it is part of a long game. It involves railroads and involves other things. So, for example, in Inner Mongolia, which China absorbed close to 100 years ago, there are now 16% Mongolians. The rest are Chinese. There are trains running 24 hours a day into Uyghur country with Chinese immigrants. They get the jobs. They are being relocated and reestablished to change the demographic balance. Tibet is same thing, trains running 24 hours a day, bringing immigrants, and it is now close to 50% Chinese. Tibet. We see the train coming down from Laos will be the coup d'etat of a direct corridor for immigration invasion, changing the demographics along the way. Already Laos are complaining about the number of Chinese in Vientiane. In Cambodia, the last figure I saw was 1.5 million Chinese. 1.5 million in a country of
14, 15 million people. Thailand, which was the thesis of all this, look at the balance of Chinese. How much is that going to change as this demographic warfare continues?
Okay, creeping colonization, basically.
I guess I don't really see Thailand as a theater in which that kind of demographic warfare is being waged. I mean, I take your point about what's happening in Tibet and in the Xinjiang region of China and a host of other places, but I don't think, I mean, the percentage of Thais with Chinese descent is already extremely high. The influence of that demographic is already extremely strong. Thaksin Shinawatra almost single-handedly made it cool to be Chinese publicly, right? To go back to China where you're from and visit your ancestral homeland and sort of celebrate and champion your Chinese background, as opposed to during previous decades, especially in the 20th century, when to be Chinese in Thailand was dangerous in many respects. So I guess I don't see it as part and parcel of China's increasing footprint in Thailand, in part because that part of its footprint, I think, pre-exists the Belt and Road Initiative and any other sort of geopolitical interest it's trying to advance here. I don't know if Joe feels differently.
It's not significant. I can see pockets of mainland Chinese. I mean, you have overseas Chinese, but you also have now increasingly pockets of mainland Chinese in Bangkok and Chiang Mai. That being said, it's not significant, and also I don't really think I'm not crediting the railroad with doing any of this. I mean, I honestly don't know what the official numbers or the official estimates are about people who are going to be taking the train from Kunming to Bangkok, but it's probably something like a 2-day, 3-day trip. Costs a fortune. You can take a plane, takes an hour and a half, right? So I think the number of tourists that would come, even with a high-speed train, is going to be insignificant compared to what could come via plane. I mean, we were getting 10 million a year. I highly doubt it would ever go above 100,000 via train. It's a very niche kind of product. So whatever colonization or demographic warfare that could happen will happen without it's not a contingent on the railway. But what we're seeing today is there is a little bit, and it's quite insignificant, and they generally it's unobtrusive.
Tom.
Thanks, Dominic. Tom Vasey, also a club member. I mean, I think that actually the last question segued right into my question, which was going to be about the, at the moment, a lot of Chinese people, a lot of Thai people have their roots in China. A lot of the important political and business families have Chinese origins, and I think it goes, far beyond people like Thaksin. I think CP Group were the first company to have a registered foreign company in China, for example. Is this significant in Sino-Thai relations?
Skip.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear.
It is significant. Let's look at the advantages China has vis-a-vis the US in terms of establishing a special relationship with Thailand. China is in virtually the same time zone. China is upstairs with no value system to come in like the uncle that comes in and criticizes Thailand every year, a couple of times. China doesn't do that. The US is 26 hours away. If we can get a Secretary of State, or God forbid, a president, to come out to the region, not just Thailand, anywhere in the region, and spend a couple of days, it's a victory, because they spend 6 hours here and 8 hours there, and then they go back on Air Force One. Meanwhile, after the tsunami, Thailand had a tsunami conference in the region of all the affected countries. And guess what? The Chinese foreign minister showed up, and he stayed 4 days. the best we could do from the White House was the White House Science Advisor, which, personally speaking, I thought was a pretty good call, actually, for a tsunami conference, but it wasn't enough. And it wasn't enough because the US is in another time zone and is just preoccupied with Ukraine or whatever you might want to say, whereas China is just up there.
Skip, can we wind up with a question? You have spent your life devoted to the betterment of relations, a large part of your working career, betterment of relations between Thailand and China. And you probably...
No, sorry, you start again.
Thailand,
start again,
US, sorry,
yeah.
I mixed you.
Yeah.
That was a good try. Thailand and the US,
Yep.
you must be quite disappointed by the state of affairs at the moment. If you were selling the upside of good relations between Thailand and the US, what would you be talking about?
Well, look, the situation today is normal. It's not just Thailand, it's Indonesia, it's the region, it's everything in this part of the world and maybe other parts of the world as well, where after World War II, the US had so many advantages that kind of just fell into their lap. And they weren't regional and they weren't linguistic and they weren't cultural and they weren't anything else. And we kind of rushed into the area and we did our best and it didn't really work out that well. And now all the other players are coming back and that's normal. That's normal. We're back to a normal situation. And guess what? It's not that China is emerging. I was told, I won't say by whom, when I went out to Indonesia, 2001, I was told, you gotta stop China. They're eating our lunch. They're eating our lunch. The emergence of China. And you know what? It's not the emergence of China, it's the re-emergence of China. And that's the challenge for the US, is it's not to deal with suddenly emerging China, it's to deal with the fact that China has been here for thousands of years and they're right in the neighborhood. They have the architecture, they have the cuisine, they have the clothing, they have the language, they have the geography. And that's a big obstacle for the US to overcome. And the period after the Second World War was not normal. That's what a generation of US policymakers has to understand, is that we don't just go in with a free ride. John.
Thank you. That's a great conclusion. I'd like to thank Skip, Benjamin and Joe for a wonderful evening. You can measure a good FCCT evening by the silence, when we don't get talking at the bar and people listen. And so by any standards, it was a good turnout, and we had 86 people in tonight, which is almost double what we've managed any time in the past 2 years. So thank you for bringing them in.